When your all-pro cornerback turns the microphone into a sledgehammer and incinerates his own locker room after practice, you know the illusion of a top 10 defense just shattered. Jaylon Johnson did not just call out defensive complacency, he exposed a unit riding on regression-prone turnover luck while masking an embarrassing sack total and brutal late-game collapses. Right now, Halas Hall is a pressure cooker as Johnson goes to war in one-on-one camp reps against explosive rookie Luther Burden III, testing whether iron sharpens iron or breaks the entire room. This isn't just vocal leadership, it is an ultimatum to a defense that could either rally behind its leader or completely fracture before week one. In this deep dive, we break down the brutal film, the statistical reality check, and the exact red zone fixes needed to justify Johnson's standard. Watch until the end to see if Chicago's secondary is built for a deep post-season run or bound for a catastrophic collapse. The echo of Jaylon Johnson's voice had barely cleared the podium before the ripple effect began tearing through the corridors of Halas Hall. Normally, post-practice media sessions during the dog days of summer are exercises in scripted mechanical optimism, where players trade sanitized generalities about team chemistry and incremental daily progress. Johnson, fresh off signing a monster contract extension that solidified his place as the undisputed anchor of this secondary, shattered that routine with a single, unvarnished diatribe. Standing drenched in sweat in front of a bank of rolling cameras, the elite cornerback refused to offer a single diplomatic platitude when asked about the defensive unit's early camp execution. Instead, he systematically dismantled any lingering self-satisfaction, declaring that the group was coasting on unearned hype and operating with a dangerous level of internal comfort. His raw assessment hit like a sudden, frigid gust of Lake Michigan, exposing an immediate rift between the narrative being spun by the front office and the sobering operational reality taking place on the practice fields. To fully grasp why Johnson's outburst sent shockwaves through Lake Forest, one must look closely at the fragile ecosystem of a NFL defense, attempting to transition from promising contender to genuine elite force. The cornerback was not merely venting general frustration over a few dropped coverage assignments or sloppy pre-snap alignments. He targeted the foundational culture of the defensive meeting room. Johnson made it brutally clear that a significant portion of the defense had begun believing its own press clippings, buying into the offseason hype that tagged them as a projected top 5 group across the league. He highlighted a pervasive lack of detail, a casual attitude toward assignments, and a fundamental absence of edge during live contact periods. By publicly airing these internal grievances, Johnson deliberately broke the sacred code of the locker room, choosing to sacrifice superficial harmony in a desperate bid to force immediate accountability before the preseason slate commenced. This scorched-earth moment represents a critical juncture for a unit whose reputation has long been bolstered by superficial successes rather than sustained down-to-down dominance. While national commentators spend the spring pointing to key highlight plays and selective turnover totals, those inside the building knew the underlying operational metrics told a far more alarming story. Johnson's public call-out stripped away that protective layer of media noise, confronting his teammates with the raw reality that their underlying tape simply did not support their inflated collective self-image. By placing his own credibility on the line, the cornerstone defender effectively drew a line in the sand, demanding that every player in that defensive unit decide whether they were truly committed to meeting elite standard or merely content to ride the coattails of past praise. The reaction across the facility was instantaneous and palpable, creating an unmistakable, heavy tension that hung over the rest of the day's operations. Coaching staff members were left scrambling to manage the emotional fallout, navigating the delicate balance between validating their star players' righteous urgency and preventing a total collapse of defensive unity. Veterans huddled in hushed conversations near their lockers, while younger players appeared visually shaken by the directness of the attack from their highest paid leader. Johnson's willingness to ignite this firestorm demonstrates how high the stakes are for this franchise heading into the season. He recognized that allowing minor cracks in discipline to go unaddressed in August inevitably leads to catastrophic fourth-quarter collapses when games actually count in October and November. Ultimately, the quote that shook Halas Hall was far more than an isolated emotional outburst from an outspoken superstar. It was an intentional, highly calculated act of psychological warfare designed to shock a dormant unit out of its dangerous summer lethargy. Johnson understood that polite encouragement and quiet film session corrections had failed to yield the necessary intensity, leaving extreme public exposure as his only remaining weapon. The true test now shifts from the podium directly back to the practice field, where this defense must rapidly choose its response. They will either allow Johnson's scathing critique to fracture their trust and divide the unit into isolated factions, or they will swallow their pride, match his uncompromising intensity, and begin the hard work of building a defense capable of surviving the brutal realities of NFL execution. Jaylon Johnson's scorching media session was far from a random act of passion. It was an acute reaction to an underlying statistical reality that the broader public has willfully ignored. When you pull back the curtain on the defense's pass campaign, the analytical blueprint reveals a unit surviving on smoke and mirrors rather than true down-to-down dominance. The surface-level narrative painted a picture of a rising contender, but the underlying numbers expose severe structural vulnerabilities that inevitably catch up to teams claiming championship aspirations. Across 17 games, this defense generated a paltry 35 total sacks, placing them squarely near the bottom third of the league in generating natural pass rush disruption. The lack of consistent upfront pressure forced the secondary to maintain coverage for agonizingly long windows, creating systemic strain that exposed the entire back seven whenever opposing quarterbacks were granted clean pockets to operate. The primary engine masking these pass-rushing deficiencies was an unsustainable reliance on turnover luck. The defense managed to stay afloat by forcing 23 interceptions and recovering key fumbles at opportunistic moments, generating splash plays that repeatedly bailed out flawed defensive drives. However, any seasoned NFL analyst or defensive coach knows that takeaway luck is notoriously volatile and rarely carries over seamlessly from one calendar year to the next. When a defense relies heavily on opponent mistakes rather than forcing structural errors through organic pressure, it operates on borrowed time. The moment those tipped balls stop falling into the hands of defensive backs or opposing ball carriers secure the football, the underlying structural rot becomes immediately visible on the scoreboard. That structural fragility was most glaringly displayed during crunch time situation of football, where the defense completely unraveled under pressure. Throughout the campaign, the unit suffered multiple late-game collapses, surrendering high-leverage drives in the fourth quarter when games hung in the balance. Opposing offenses repeatedly carved through softer zone coverage shells, capitalizing on a total absence of late-game pass rush to put together game-winning or game-tying drives. The film showed a team that surrendered 24.4 points per game, ranking an abysmal 23rd in the NFL, proving that when takeaways were taken out of the equation, the defense was routinely moved off the ball with ease. Johnson recognized that this statistical house of cards was bound to collapse, and his anger stemmed from knowing that repeating those exact same habits would lead to an early playoff exit or missing the postseason entirely. Compounding these structural concerns is the harsh reality of historical regression. Analytics consistently demonstrate that teams who finish with high turnover differentials but low sack totals experience a massive downward correction in subsequent seasons. The pass rush, which managed only 25 sacks across home contests and an invisible 10 on the road, failed to establish any true home field intimidating presence. Without a dominant edge rusher constantly collapsing the pocket, the defense was forced to over-blitz, leaving gaping holes in the intermediate passing windows that capable offensive coordinators exploited at will. The numbers painted an indisputable picture. This was not a top-tier defensive unit, but rather an average, bend-but-don't-break group that rode an extraordinary wave of fortunate bounces to hide its deepest flaws. By stepping to the podium and delivering his scathing critique, Johnson was directly confronting this statistical deception. He was refusing to allow his teammates to hide behind a record that masked deep-seated execution problems. The defensive front was not winning its one-on-one matchups, the linebackers were missing critical run-gap assignments, and the secondary was allowing far too much cushion on third and manageable situations. Johnson understood that unless the front four begins generating organic pressure and the back seven tightens its coverage thresholds, the turnover luck will inevitably dry up, exposing the unit to brutal national scrutiny. The numbers do not lie. And as camp progresses, the defense is running out of time to fix the glaring mathematical realities that their star cornerback laid bare for the world to see. The fiery rhetoric from the podium immediately transformed the practice field into a high-stakes arena, where Jaylon Johnson set out to prove that his scathing words were matched by an uncompromising standard of physical execution. Nowhere was this standout tested more fiercely than in the marquee one-on-one coverage drills, where the veteran all-pro cornerback found himself lined up directly across from dynamic wide receiver Luther Burden III. Drafted to inject explosive, game-breaking run-after-catch playmaking into the offense, the young wideout represents the exact brand of elite, high-velocity talent that modern NFL defenses must contain to survive. As the whistle blew for live contact reps, the atmosphere shifted instantly into a relentless psychological and physical battleground, turning routine training camp reps into a micro-litmus test for the entire team's competitive DNA. On the very first rep of their marquee series, Johnson delivered a brutal physical welcome to the young receiver, stepping up to the line of scrimmage in tight pressman alignment and jamming Burden with a powerful two-handed strike right at the snap. The violent contact disrupted Burden's initial release timing, forcing the rookie to adjust his route trajectory on the fly while attempting to create separation along the boundary. Instead of giving an inch, Johnson mirrored the route with footwork that was as suffocating as it was precise, refusing to cede the inside lane and walling off the receiver toward the sideline. When the pass arrived, Johnson extended his frame to swat the ball away with authority, stepping over the play to let Burden and the entire offensive sideline know that free releases and easy completions were officially revoked under his watch. Yet, true elite competition is never a one-sided affair, and Burden responded with the raw dynamic athleticism that made him a focal point of Chicago's offensive reconstruction. On the subsequent rep, Burden utilized a sharp stutter step release, faking an outside stride before sinking his hips and violently cutting back across the middle on an intermediate slant route. The sudden deceleration forced Johnson to momentarily turn his hips, opening up a razor-thin window of space that allowed Burden to pluck the pass out of the air in stride and turn upfield for a massive chunk play. The offensive unit erupted in celebration, but the reaction from the defensive secondary was one of pure electric focus, as Johnson immediately called for another rep to reset the matchup's tone. This iron sharpens iron dynamic became the captivating engine of the entire afternoon practice, elevating the intensity of every drill on the field. Johnson was not simply attempting to win a practice battle, he was deliberately putting on a masterclass in how an elite defender prepares for the physical realities of Sunday afternoons. He consistently challenged Burden at the point of attack, leveraging subtle body positioning, aggressive hand fighting, and precise boundary leverage to squeeze down every passing lane. For Burden, facing a cornerback who refuses to rely on conservative cushions offered an invaluable trial by fire, forcing the young playmaker to refine his route-running nuances, adjust to tight coverage contact, and develop the mental resilience required to compete at the highest level of professional football. As the team session drew to a close, the intense series between Johnson and Burden stood as a clear beacon for what this team could become if every position group embraced the same unforgiving standard. Johnson's aggressive approach proved that his public callout was not born out of personal animosity, but out of a desperate desire to eliminate the lingering softness that plagued the defense in critical moments. By locking horns daily with the team's top talent, Johnson showed that elite defensive play is not forged through polite rehearsals or comfortable practice routines, but through chaotic, high-intensity competition that pushes every player to their absolute physical limit. The immediate fallout from Jaylon Johnson's public tirade ignited a fierce debate regarding the nature of true leadership within a professional locker room. In an era dominated by media-trained athletes who favor soft encouragement and private conflict resolution, Johnson's aggressive scorched-earth approach stood as a radical departure from standard modern protocol. Passive leadership often allows insidious bad habits to take root unnoticed, creating a culture where minor mistakes are quietly excused until they manifest as fatal late-game collapses. Johnson recognized that the team's dangerous comfort level demanded an immediate shock to the system, choosing to act as an uncompromising firebrand rather than an accommodating captain. By publicly challenging the defense's work ethic, he elevated accountability from a private suggestion to a public obligation, forcing every player in the defensive room to confront their own level of daily output. However, the line between constructive, high-stakes leadership and total locker room fracture is paper-thin, and the initial structural response revealed deep ideological fault lines within the unit. Several defensive veterans initially bristled at the public nature of the critique, privately questioning whether exposing internal film room flaws to the national media crossed an unwritten boundary of brotherhood. In the immediate aftermath of the rant, subtle body language during positional meetings betrayed clear friction as players separated into distinct cliques, those who viewed Johnson's words as a necessary call to arms versus those who perceived it as self-serving deflection. The coaching staff faced an immediate operational challenge: prevent the defensive room from turning inward while ensuring the underlying truth of Johnson's words was not lost in the emotional crossfire. The psychological tension reached a critical peak during subsequent full-team film sessions, where the raw footage laid bare the exact execution failures Johnson had denounced. Viewing joint mistakes on screen alongside the public headlines stripped away any remaining excuses, forcing the unit into an uncomfortable collective reckoning. Leaders who had previously relied on quiet, lead-by-example styles were forced to step out of their comfort zones and speak up, either aligning with Johnson's high-pressure standard or offering an alternative vision for how the group should reset its competitive edge. The quiet comfort that had defined the early days of summer evaporated entirely, replaced by a hyper-vigilant atmosphere where every rep, every film room response, and every missed assignment carried immense interpersonal weight. Ultimately, Johnson's confrontational gamble exposed the fundamental difference between a team that merely enjoys good chemistry and one capable of sustaining championship resilience. Passive leadership preserves short-term comfort at the expense of long-term operational success, creating an environment where standards gradually erode under the weight of unaddressed mediocrity. Johnson understood that true defensive unity is not forged through easy camaraderie, but through the shared endurance of brutal, unrelenting accountability. By forcing his teammates to endure public heat, he initiated a crucial trial by fire, forcing the defensive room to decide whether it possessed the mental toughness to embrace uncomfortable truths and rise to an elite level. As the secondary recalibrated its internal communication, the initial shock of the rant began converting into an intense, tangible urgency across all levels of the defense. Players began staying late for extra film study, communication pre-snap grew noticeably sharper, and the passive acceptance of subpar execution was replaced by instantaneous on-field corrections from positional leaders. Johnson's aggressive vocal style had successfully ruptured the status quo, proving that conflict, when rooted in a relentless desire to win, can serve as the ultimate catalyst for cultural transformation. The room had not fractured. Instead, it had been forced to mature, shedding its lingering summer complacency in exchange for an edge that would define their entire identity moving forward. With the dust settling on Jaylon Johnson's explosive locker room challenge, the focus shifts to the relentless operational math that will ultimately dictate whether Chicago can transition from a flashy, turnover-dependent group into a legitimate top 10 defense. Johnson's fiery standard is not a mere philosophical posture. It is an unforgiving ultimatum that demands structural transformation in the two most critical areas of modern NFL defensive execution: third down efficiency and red zone leverage. Last season, opponent conversion rates on third and manageable repeatedly exposed the secondary's softer coverage cushions and the front four's inability to generate organic pressure without bringing extra blitzers. If this unit intends to validate Johnson's public call-out, it must stop bleeding high-leverage conversions and transform third down from a stressful rescue mission into a suffocating trap where opposing offenses are systematically turned over on downs or forced into long field goal attempts. Executing that level of third down dominance requires a fundamental redesign of how the defense handles intermediate passing lanes. In previous campaigns, quarterbacks operating against Chicago enjoyed clean pockets and extended release windows, allowing them to patiently dissect zone coverage schemes while moving the chains on 3rd and 6 or longer. Under Johnson's uncompromising vision, the defensive front must compress the pocket from the interior while edge rushers capture the outside shoulders of pass protectors, forcing opposing signal callers to throw early into tight, contested windows. When the front four forces uncomfortable off-platform throws, Johnson and the secondary can unleash their ball-hawking instinct without leaving massive structural voids in the secondary. Winning third down is the absolute baseline of defensive competency, and until Chicago consistently forces 3-and-outs against upper echelon quarterbacks, any claim of possessing elite status remains pure fiction. Equally decisive is the defense's operational threshold inside the red zone, where field space compresses and sheer physical toughness replaces scheme deception. Last year, when opposing offenses penetrated inside the 20-yard line, Chicago's defensive unit surrendered touchdowns at an unsustainable rate, failing to impose its physical willpower in tight quarters. A true top 10 defense treats the red zone as sacred territory, relying on violent gap discipline up front and aggressive press coverage on the outside to turn potential 7-point drives into forced field goals. Red zone stops require instantaneous communication between linebackers and safeties, eliminating quick slant windows and high-low route combinations designed to exploit static zone defenders. Johnson's daily battles against explosive playmakers in camp were designed specifically for these high-pressure scenarios, instilling a relentless mindset that refuses to concede an inch when backed against its own end zone. The ultimate test for this franchise is whether Johnson's scorched-earth leadership acts as the foundational spark for a historic defensive leap or the beginning of a slow, corrosive fracturing process. If the defensive line translates summer frustration into genuine edge pressure, and if the back seven tightens its coverage thresholds on third, down, and inside the red zone, Chicago possesses the raw athletic ceiling to stand among the NFL's elite defenses. However, if the unit defaults to its old habits, relying on volatile turnover luck to mask systemic pass rush flaws and passive execution, Johnson's brutal rant will stand as the opening chapter of a predictable late-season collapse. The illusion has been burned away, the standards have been publicly declared, and the entire league is watching to see if Chicago's defense will rise to meet its leader's challenge or fall apart under the weight of its own unearned expectations.